The wind never slept. It was the first and last thing Evelyn Whitmore knew of this new land. It came from the west, a dry and ceaseless breath that carried red dust from plains she could not see and the scent of pine from mountains that were only a rumor. The dust settled on everything. A fine crimson powder that coated the canvas of their wagon, worked its way into the weave of her dress, and left a grit on her teeth in the morning. She was 19 years old, and she had believed this land of promise would be green. James slept beside her, his breathing a steady rhythm against the wind's low moan, even in sleep. His hand rested near the rifle propped against the wagon wheel. They were part of a train of 6 wagons, a small island of hope and iron-shod wheels in an ocean of rock and sage. For weeks, the journey had been a routine of grueling days and watchful nights. The sun was a hammer, the threat of drought a constant whisper carried on that same tireless wind. At night, the stars were so bright they seemed to scratch at the darkness, cold and impossibly distant. Evelyn would lie awake, watching them, feeling like an ancestor she had not yet become was watching over her, a silent witness to their struggle. Her dream was simple, a small plot of earth, a cabin built from timber they would fell themselves, and the sound of a child's laughter instead of the wind's constant lament. James had shown her the map, his finger tracing a blue line that he promised was a creek, real water, not the brackish stuff they rationed from the barrels, a place to wash away the red dust, a place to build a life. That was all she wanted, a home. She stirred, the pre-dawn air holding a chill that the day's heat would soon obliterate. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of the camp waking up were absent. There was no clink of a coffee pot, no soft murmur of voices. There was only the wind, and a new sound beneath it, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like a faraway heart. James was awake in an instant, his body tense. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers in the gloom, and in them she saw a fear that mirrored her own. He pushed the rifle into her hands. His words were a bare whisper. Go for the rocks if they come. Stay downwind. Then the world exploded. It was not a single sound, but a chorus of them. A high, terrifying cry that seemed to come from all directions at once. The splintering of wood. The terrified scream of a horse. An arrow thudded into the canvas wall of their wagon, the feathered shaft quivering inches from her head. Fire bloomed in the darkness, a hungry orange tongue licking at the dry canvas of the wagon ahead of them. James shoved her out of the back of the wagon, his face a grim mask in the flickering light. He fired his rifle, the boom a deafening crack in the chaos. He yelled something at her, a name, a direction, but the wind snatched the words away. She saw shadows on horseback, figures painted with clay and purpose, moving through the camp with a brutal efficiency. They were not demons, they were men, and their fury was a palpable thing. Run toward the wind, Evelyn. James's voice finally cut through the din, raw with desperation, but it was too late. A horseman loomed out of the swirling smoke and dust, his face a mask of fierce concentration. James turned, raising his rifle, but he was not fast enough. An arrow appeared in his chest, a dark, slender thing that seemed to sprout from his own flesh. He made a small sound, a gasp of surprise, and his eyes found hers, the firelight reflected in them. And in that instant, she saw not a fighter, not a pioneer, but just her James, the boy who had promised her a creek and a home. Then he fell. A scream built in her throat, but it never found voice. A rough hand tangled in her hair, yanking her back. The ground scraped against her knees. She was surrounded, the smell of sweat and smoke and leather filling her senses. She fought, a wild and useless struggle against arms that were like iron bands. She saw the faces of her captors, streaked with black and red paint, their eyes hard. This was the reality behind the stories. The fear whispered around campfires. This was the savage wilderness come to claim them. She was dragged through the camp, the scene a nightmare of burning wagons and silent bodies. The stars, those ancient witnesses, were fading into the bruised purple of the approaching dawn. Her gaze was fixed on the still form of her husband. His face turned toward the dust he had hoped to tame. The simple dream of a home was now a pyre, its smoke mingling with the morning mist. They threw her to the ground in the center of what remained of the camp. The attack was over as quickly as it had begun. The raiders moved among the wreckage, gathering supplies, rifles, and horses. Evelyn knelt in the dust, her mind a numb and empty space. The fear had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard ember of defiance. She would not weep for them to see. She would not give them her tears. A shadow fell over her. She looked up and saw him. He was different from the others. He sat atop a lean pinto pony, not joining the plunder, but watching. There was no paint on his face, which was stark and severe, all sharp angles and unyielding lines. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. His eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on her. He carried an authority that was as natural as the wind, a quiet stillness in the heart of the storm he had unleashed. This had to be their leader. One of the warriors, a young man with a cruel twist to his mouth, approached her. He said something in a language she did not understand, his voice low and guttural. He reached for the locket around her neck, the small silver oval that held a lock of her mother's hair. Evelyn flinched back, her hand flying up to protect it. It was all she had left. The warrior laughed and his hand tightened, ready to rip it from her. A sharp word cut through the air. It came from the man on the pinto. He had not raised his voice, but the single word was enough. The young warrior froze, his hand dropping away from her neck. He turned and scowled at his leader, but then he backed away, melting back into the group. The leader dismounted, his movements fluid and economical. He walked toward her, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her torn dress, her dusty face, and the defiant set of her jaw. She met his gaze, her own pride a fragile shield against the terror that threatened to consume her. She expected to see cruelty, or triumph, or contempt. She saw none of those things. She saw a deep, world-weary intelligence, and something else, something she could not name. It was as if he were looking not at a captive, but through her, into the very heart of her loss and her defiance. He was Kohana, though she would not know that name for some time. He was a leader burdened by the slow death of his people, a man fighting for a future that was vanishing like a mirage with every new railroad tie and telegraph pole. He saw the iron tracks as a snake strangling the life from the land, the singing wires as a cage descending upon his world. His raid was not for plunder, but for survival, a desperate act of resistance. He looked at the girl on the ground. He had seen fear in the eyes of white women before. He had seen hatred and pleading. In her eyes, he saw a spirit that was not yet broken. He saw the same resilience as a cottonwood tree growing in a dry wash, its roots digging deep for life. To kill her would be a waste. To let her go was a risk. But something in her unbroken gaze held him. He turned to his men. His voice was quiet, yet it carried over the crackle of the dying fires and the mournful sigh of the wind. The words were Apache, a command that was absolute. Keep her alive. No one is to touch her. They did not linger at the site of the massacre. As the sun began to climb, turning the smoke-stained sky a blistering white, Evelyn was pulled to her feet and placed on a horse. Her hands were not tied, a small, strange mercy that she did not understand. The journey began immediately, a silent and swift departure from the ruins of her life. They moved south, away from the established trails and into a labyrinth of red rock and shadow. The world became a blur of relentless motion. They rode through steep-walled canyons where the air was cool and their passage echoed strangely. They crossed the ghostly white beds of rivers that had died of thirst long ago. The sand so deep the horses struggled with every step. Then they would climb again, up into ridges of pinon and juniper, the sharp, clean scent of the trees a stark contrast to the ever-present dust. Evelyn rode in the middle of the column, a solitary figure in a calico dress amidst the leather and buckskin of her captors. No one spoke to her. She was a piece of cargo, a ghost they carried with them. In the first days, her grief was a physical weight, so heavy she could barely breathe. The image of James falling was burned into her mind, a constant, silent scream behind her eyes. But the sheer hardship of the journey forced its way in, demanding her attention. The sun was relentless. The thirst was a living thing, a rasp in her throat and a fire in her belly. She learned to watch the others, to mimic the way they conserved their energy, their movements spare and deliberate. Life became a series of stark, simple details. She learned the sound of the warriors meticulously covering their trail, using leafy branches to erase the marks of their passage. She saw how they would sometimes ride their horses through rocky ground to avoid leaving prints. At night, guards were posted, silent sentinels who melted into the landscape. She would lie on the hard ground, wrapped in a coarse blanket they had given her, and watch the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had once seemed like benevolent witnesses and now felt like cold, indifferent eyes. Water was the most precious currency. It was rationed from waterskins with a discipline that was absolute. On the third day, as the sun reached its zenith and the heat shimmered off the rocks, her throat was so dry she could not swallow. She must have swayed in the saddle, for the column halted. Kohana rode back to her side. He said nothing, simply unslung a waterskin and held it out. Her hands trembled as she took it. She drank, the lukewarm water a miracle on her tongue. She expected to have to give it back after a few sips, but he made no move to take it. She drank until the worst of the thirst was gone, then handed it back, her eyes downcast, a confusing mix of gratitude and resentment churning within her. It was in these small moments that the cracks in her certainty began to appear. The men she was with were not the one-dimensional fiends from the stories she had heard. They were a people, a community on the move. She saw women in the group, their faces impassive but their hands constantly busy, mending clothes, preparing the scarce food. There were children, too, who rode strapped to their mothers or on their own small ponies, their dark eyes watching her with a solemn curiosity. One evening, she saw a little boy trip and fall. His mother scooped him up, murmuring soft words to him, her touch gentle as she brushed the dust from his cheek. The simple, universal act of a mother comforting her child struck Evelyn with a force that surprised her. She watched Kohana. He remained an enigma, a man of few words and even fewer wasted motions. He was their unquestioned leader. His commands were quiet, but his men obeyed instantly. He was the first to wake and the last to sleep, his vigilance a tangible shield around his people. She saw him mete out discipline, a sharp rebuke to a young man who was careless with a waterskin. But she also saw him share his own meager portion of dried meat with an elder whose teeth were failing. One morning, as they paused by a small, muddy spring, he gestured for her to wash. The other warriors watched her, their gazes unsettling. Kohana turned his back to her, a deliberate and clear signal for the others to do the same, granting her a small, invaluable moment of privacy. It was a gesture of profound and unexpected humanity. He was a man of discipline, but it was a discipline that held a quiet compassion at its core. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Evelyn began to pick up a few words of their language, the sounds strange and beautiful to her ear. She learned the word for sun, for rock, for horse. One evening, sitting by the small, smokeless fire they allowed themselves after dark, she pointed to a waterskin and tried to say the word for water, a word that sounded like two to her. A throaty sound escaped her lips, more like a grunt than a word. One of the younger warriors, a man named Nantan, who often watched her with open hostility, let out a short, harsh laugh. He spoke to the others, and several of them smirked. Evelyn felt a flush of shame and anger heat her face. Kohana looked up from the arrow he was straightening. He spoke to Nantan, his voice even and low, and the laughter died. Then he looked at Evelyn. and for the first time, she saw something other than severity in his eyes. It was a flicker of something almost like amusement. He pointed to the waterskin. "Tell," he said, his pronunciation clear and precise. Then he pointed to a nearby horse. "Lee," he said. He looked back at her. "The horse needs water too. You are halfway right." The simple statement, delivered with his characteristic gravity, was so unexpected that a small smile touched Evelyn's lips before she could stop it. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it was the first time she had smiled since the attack. It was a tiny bridge of shared humor across an abyss of violence and fear. But the bridge was a precarious one. The animosity from Nantan and some of the other young men was a constant, simmering threat. They were the ones whose families had suffered most directly from the encroachment of the white settlers. They saw her not as an individual, but as a symbol of the people who were destroying their world. She would often feel their eyes on her, filled with a resentment that made her skin crawl. She was grateful for Kohana's protection, but she was acutely aware of how fragile it was. He was one man, and their hatred was a fire that could easily flare out of control. Her world, once defined by her hopes for the future, was now a tense and watchful present. She was both a captive and a student, learning the hard lessons of survival in a land that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. She learned to read the signs of the land, to understand the importance of a patch of shade or a change in the wind. She was beginning to see the world not as a thing to be conquered and tamed, but as a powerful and complex entity to be respected. The people she was with were no longer just a terrifying monolith. They were individuals. She saw an old woman weaving a blanket, her fingers moving with a practiced grace, the complex geometric patterns seeming to tell a story Evelyn could not read. The blanket was a history book, a map of a people's memory. She saw a young man carefully crafting a flute from a river reed, his fierce warrior's face softening with concentration. Each night, the campfire was a small circle of warmth and light against the vast, indifferent darkness. It was a circle of community, of shared stories and quiet companionship. She sat outside that circle, an alien presence, but she was beginning to understand that the circle itself was a fragile thing, a sanctuary against a world that was closing in on them. They were not marauding savages. They were a family, fighting for their existence. One night, a week into their journey, a deep weariness settled into her bones. The day had been long and hot. The tensions in the camp were high. Nantan had argued with another warrior, their voices sharp and angry until Kohana had intervened. Now, a fragile peace had settled over the camp. A man was tapping out a slow, somber rhythm on a small drum. The sound was like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the land itself. Evelyn sat huddled in her blanket, watching the flames dance. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the stoic faces around her. She felt a profound and aching loneliness, a sense of being utterly adrift. She looked up, her gaze drawn across the fire. Kohana was watching her. His face was unreadable in the shifting light, but his eyes held hers. It was not a look of pity, or of anger, or of desire. It was a look of quiet, steady acknowledgement. It was the look of a man seeing another human being, stripped of all artifice, two lonely souls on opposite sides of a fire, bound together by a violence neither had chosen, their futures as uncertain as the shapes of the dancing flames. The drumbeat continued, a steady rhythm in the vast, silent darkness of the American West. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the land. The journey was no longer a panicked flight, but a steady, purposeful migration. Evelyn learned to anticipate the needs of the day, to read the angle of the sun and know when they would stop for water, to feel the shift in the wind and know that the temperature was about to drop. She rode with a straight back, her body having learned the motion of the horse, her mind a quiet and constant observer. One afternoon, they stopped in the shade of a massive rock overhang, a cool respite from the oppressive heat. The others were busy checking the horses' hooves and replenishing their water skins from a seep in the rock face. Kohana approached her, not on horseback, but on foot. He moved with a silence that still unsettled her. He stopped before her and, after a long moment, placed his hand flat against his own chest. Kohana, he said. The name was low and resonant, like stones shifting deep in the earth. He did not say, "My name is..." He just gave the name itself, a simple offering. She understood. She mirrored the gesture, her hand resting on her own chest, over the frantic beating of her heart. "Evelyn," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding hers. He then said a word she did not understand. "Tahan." He did not gesture this time, but his gaze was so intent that she felt it like a touch, a gentle pressure on her very soul. He saw the question in her eyes. "New dawn," he said in English. His use of her language startled her. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single word to her. The idea settled in her mind, heavy and strange. He had given her a new name, a new meaning, in his own tongue. It was not a term of endearment. It felt more like a prophecy, or a burden. That night, the world changed. The air grew thick and heavy, the wind that had been their constant companion falling into an unnerving silence. A strange, yellowish light filtered through the clouds that had gathered on the horizon, swallowing the stars. The horses were restless, their ears twitching, their nostrils flared. The people moved with a quiet urgency, securing their few belongings, checking the knots on the makeshift shelters they had erected against the canyon wall. The storm broke with a sudden, violent fury. The wind came first, not as a breath but as a physical blow, a solid wall of air that tore through the small camp. It shrieked and howled, a sound of pure rage. Rain followed, not in drops but in sheets, cold and lashing. It was a deluge, turning the dry ground to instant mud. Evelyn's small lean-to, made of a blanket stretched over a juniper branch, was ripped away in the first gust. She was left exposed, the wind tearing at her clothes, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She huddled against the rock wall, shivering, blinded by the rain and the darkness. For a moment, a pure, primal terror seized her. This was nature's fury, an elemental power that dwarfed their human struggles. A figure appeared through the maelstrom. It was Kohana. He was holding a heavy buffalo hide, fighting to keep his footing against the wind. He came to her, his body a bulwark against the storm. He did not speak. There were no words that could be heard over the roar of the wind. He worked quickly, using his own body to shield her as he angled the heavy hide against the rock face, creating a small, precarious pocket of shelter. He pressed the edges of it down with heavy stones, his movements sure and economical even in the chaos. He had to lean close for her to hear him, his voice a low rumble against the high-pitched scream of the wind. No fear. It was not a comfort, but a command. And strangely, it worked. The terror receded, replaced by a grim determination to simply endure. She helped him, her cold, numb fingers pressing down on the hide, adding her weight to his. They worked together in the roaring darkness, a man and a woman from two different worlds, united for a moment against the common enemy of the storm. When the shelter was as secure as they could make it, they huddled inside it. The space was small, their shoulders nearly touching. Outside, the storm raged, but within their small cave of hide and rock, there was a fragile stillness. He did not move away. He simply stayed, a solid and reassuring presence in the wild night. Evelyn found herself listening to the sound of his breathing, a steady rhythm beneath the chaotic symphony of the storm. It was the first time she had felt anything resembling safety since her world had been torn apart. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. By morning, the sky was a pristine, washed clean blue. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. The camp was a wreck of mud and scattered belongings. But the people were already at work, their spirits seemingly undaunted by the night's violence. Evelyn emerged from her shelter, stiff and cold, but alive. She saw Kohana directing the repairs. She walked over to him, her feet sinking into the soft mud. "The wind howled like a wolf last night," she said. the words coming out before she could think. He turned to look at her. His face was stern as always, but his eyes were clear. "Wolves know how to howl," he said, his tone perfectly serious. "The wind only copies." He turned back to his work, but not before she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. It was the faintest hint of a smile, a brief flicker of light, but it was there. The moment of connection was shattered later that day. Nantan, the young warrior whose hostility toward her had never wavered, confronted Kohana. He did not shout, but his voice was venomous. Carrying across the quiet camp, he spoke in his own language, but his gestures made his meaning clear. He pointed a finger at Evelyn, then jabbed it toward Kohana's chest. The words "white woman" were clear enough. He was accusing his leader, his tone contemptuous. Kohana's face became a mask of stone. He listened without interruption until Nantan was finished. Then he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. The words were few, but they had the force of a physical blow. Nantan's face darkened with fury, but he turned and stalked away without another word. The confrontation was over, but it left a poison in the air. The fragile peace had been broken. Evelyn was the cause of the discord, a stone thrown into the placid surface of their lives. Later, as Evelyn sat trying to mend a tear in her dress, an older woman came and sat beside her. She had a kind, wrinkled face and hands that were never still. She began to speak in a low voice, mixing her own language with gestures and the few English words she knew. She told a story. It was a story about Kohana's brother, a great warrior, who had been captured by the blue-coated soldiers. They took him to a fort, a place with high walls, and there they had cut his hair. The woman's hands mimicked the motion of shears, a sharp, brutal cutting. They took his name, she said, and gave him a white man's name. They took his spirit. The brother had never been the same. Evelyn listened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She thought of the telegraph poles she had seen from a distance on her journey west. Straight, unnatural lines marching across the vast, rolling plains. James had called them progress. She now saw them as they must see them, the straight, unbending lines of a cage. She thought of the great herds of cattle she had seen, displacing the buffalo, their fences carving the open land into squares. This was the source of their rage, a deep, collective wound of humiliation and loss. It was not just about land. It was about dignity. That evening, the mood in the camp was somber. The shared ordeal of the storm was forgotten, replaced by the simmering conflict Nantan had ignited. Evelyn felt more alone than ever. She was not just a captive. She was a curse, a source of weakness in their leader, a symbol of the world that was systematically destroying them. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Kohana walked over to where she sat apart from the others. He stood before her for a long moment, his face cast in shadow. Then he reached down and touched the simple rope bracelet that one of the women had put on her wrist days ago, a practical thing to keep her sleeve out of the fire. His touch was light, his fingers barely grazing her skin. He did not untie it. He simply loosened the knot, just a fraction of an inch, before letting his hand fall away. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it spoke volumes. The line between captive and something else was blurring. He was acknowledging the change. He was acknowledging her. He looked at her then, and the weariness of the world seemed to be in his eyes. He was a leader caught between the anger of his people and a nascent compassion he did not understand. He looked at her, and this time, he did not fight the smile. It was a true smile, a sad and weary thing, but it reached his eyes, and in that moment, in the heart of the vast and unforgiving wilderness, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. Hope. Kohana's smile, as rare and fleeting as a desert rain, did not go unnoticed. It became another piece of evidence for Nantan to use against him. The whispers grew more frequent, the glances more hostile, the atmosphere in the camp, once a mix of watchfulness and routine, became heavy with a sour tension. Nantan fanned the flames of discontent with a quiet and persistent poison. "The white shadow brings misfortune," he would say to the other young men as they cleaned their rifles. A deer that should have been an easy kill escaped. A water source they expected to find was dry. Small misfortunes, the kind that were common in this unforgiving land, were now laid at Evelyn's feet. She was an omen, a curse. "The woman's presence softens our leader," Nantan murmured. "He looks at her, and he forgets the blood of our brothers." Evelyn felt the shift in the community like a change in barometric pressure. Women who had previously offered her a quiet nod now turned their faces away. Children who had watched her with curious eyes were now pulled back by their mothers when she passed. She was an infection in the body of the tribe, and their collective immune system was beginning to reject her. The most painful part was watching what it was doing to Kohana. She saw him in council with the elders, his face set in hard lines as he listened to their concerns. She saw the open defiance in Nantan's eyes, a challenge to his authority that grew bolder each day. She had become a weapon used against him by his own people. The man who had shown her unexpected kindness, who had commanded no fear in the heart of a storm, was now paying a price for her life. His act of mercy was being twisted into a sign of weakness. The question began to haunt her in the quiet hours before dawn. Who am I here? She was not a wife, not a daughter, not a member of the tribe. She was a ghost from a world they despised, a living reminder of the violence that had brought them together. She was a burden, and her continued presence was eroding the very foundation of the man who had spared her. She had been a captive, then a guest of a sort, and now she was simply a problem. The realization settled in her with a cold, clear certainty. Her survival was a danger to his. Her life was a threat to his leadership and the unity of his people. And in that desolate understanding, a new kind of freedom took root, the freedom to choose. She did not make the decision out of hatred for her captors, or even out of a desperate longing for her old life. That life was a ruin, a field of ash and smoke. She made the decision to save Kohana from the consequences of his own compassion. She would disappear. She would lift the curse from his shoulders by removing herself from his world. She would give him back his authority by taking away the source of the challenge. It was the only gift she could offer, an act of repayment for the life he had given her. She planned it for 2 days, her mind sharp and focused. She watched the changing of the guards, noting the rhythm of their patrols. She saved a small portion of her dried meat each day, hiding it in a fold of her dress. She observed the direction of the sun, the lay of the land, trying to burn a map into her memory. She would head east, back toward the rising sun, back toward the world of telegraph poles and iron horses. On the 3rd morning, in the deep, starless dark that precedes the dawn, she moved. The camp was asleep, the only sound the soft breathing of the horses and the low sigh of the wind. She slipped out from under her blanket, a shadow among shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drum in the silence. Every pebble that shifted under her worn boots sounded like a landslide. She made it to the edge of the camp, her body a single, taut nerve. She slipped past the last sleeping form and into the open land. The air was cold, and she began to walk, putting the sleeping camp at her back. She did not run. Running was for the panicked and the foolish. She walked with a steady, determined pace, her gaze fixed on the faint lightning of the eastern sky. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a world of stunning and brutal immensity. She was a tiny, solitary speck in a vast landscape of rock and sand. The camp was gone, swallowed by the distance. There was no trail to follow, no landmark to guide her. There was only the sun, her merciless companion. By midday, the heat was a physical entity, a weight pressing down on her, stealing the moisture from her body. Her water was gone, her lips cracked, her throat a tube of fire. The landscape shimmered, the heat creating phantom lakes on the horizon that vanished as she approached. She saw a distant cloud of dust, and her heart leaped. Cavalry. Salvation. But the cloud dissipated. A trick of the wind. Another ghost in this land of ghosts. Her small store of meat was long gone. Hunger was a dull ache, but thirst was a roaring monster. She stumbled on, her mind beginning to fray at the edges. She imagined the sound of a creek, the feel of cool water on her skin. She kept walking, driven by the single, clear purpose that had set her on this path. She was freeing him. In the late afternoon, a sound made her freeze. It was a dry, buzzing rattle, a sound that sent a spike of pure, cold fear through her. She looked down. Not 5 feet from her, coiled in the sparse shade of a sagebrush, was a rattlesnake. It watched her with black, unblinking eyes, its tail a blur of motion. She backed away slowly, her breath held tight in her chest, her heart trying to beat its way out of her ribs. The snake held its ground, a small king in its vast and terrible kingdom. She gave it a wide berth, her legs trembling, the encounter leaving her more drained than hours of walking. She was starting to lose hope when she saw it. Not a mirage this time, but a shape, dark and real against the setting sun. A rider. He was coming from the west, from the direction of the camp. He was not riding hard, but with a steady, ground-eating lope that spoke of a deep familiarity with the land and the horse beneath him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She simply stopped and waited, a profound and weary resignation settling over her. She had failed. He rode up to her and stopped, his pinto pony breathing hard. It was Kohana. His face was a mask of dust and exhaustion. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, a mix of anger, relief, and something she could not decipher. He dismounted and walked toward her. She stood her ground, lifting her chin, her pride the only thing she had left. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the dust clinging to his eyelashes. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. "Why did you run?" he asked. His voice was rough with thirst, the English words sounding strange in the vast emptiness. She met his gaze directly, her own voice a dry rasp. "Because I do not belong to anyone here." The words hung in the air between them. It was the truth, the whole complex truth. She was not his possession to keep, and she had no place among his people to stay. She was a foreign object, a source of friction, and her removal was the only logical solution. She expected him to be angry. She expected him to grab her, to tie her hands, to drag her back to the camp as a shamed and punished runaway. He did nothing of the sort. He looked at her, and a deep understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes. He saw not an escape, but a sacrifice. He saw the truth behind her desperate flight. She swayed on her feet, the last of her strength giving out. Her knees buckled. Before she could fall, he caught her. His hands were strong and steady on her arms. He lowered her gently to the ground, then unslung his own water skin and held it to her lips. She drank, the water a shock to her system, a blessed relief that was almost painful. When she had drunk her fill, he helped her to her feet. He did not reach for a rope. He did not utter a word of reproach. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding a profound and sorrowful respect. "Your freedom," he said, his voice low and certain, "was always yours." He turned and pointed east, far in the distance. A thin, shimmering line cut across the horizon, catching the last rays of the setting sun. A river. It was a silver ribbon in the distance, a tangible and real path. It was a promise of life, a promise of a way back. "Go," he said. He pressed the nearly full water skin into her hands. Then he turned, swung himself onto his horse, and without a backward glance, rode back the way he had come, a solitary figure disappearing into the twilight. Evelyn stood alone, the water skin clutched in her hands, and watched him go. She was free. The chains of captivity were broken, but the freedom was a raw and open wound. It was a vast and terrifying emptiness, a silence that echoed with the beat of two lonely hearts. now miles apart. She turned and began to walk toward the silver river, her freedom as heavy and as painful as a fresh, deep cut. She reached the river near dawn the next day. It was not the wide, clear blue ribbon of her dreams, but a shallow, muddy artery fringed with cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering in the morning breeze. She fell to her knees at its edge, plunging her hands and then her face into the cool, silty water. She drank until her stomach ached, the water a gritty, life-giving balm. For a long time, she simply sat by the water's edge, the silence broken only by the murmur of the current and the call of a lone bird. This was it. This was freedom. She could follow the river east, toward the rising sun. Sooner or later, she would find a settlement, a fort, a sign of the world she had left behind. She was free. The word echoed in the empty spaces of her mind. Free. But the feeling was not the soaring elation she might have once imagined. It was a vast, aching hollowness. She had been so focused on the act of leaving, on the single and driving purpose of releasing Kohana from the burden of her presence, that she had not truly considered what came after. She leaned over the slow-moving water and looked at her reflection. A stranger looked back at her. The face was thin and burned by the sun, the hair a tangled, sun-bleached mess. The eyes were what held her. They were older, shadowed with a knowledge of fire and loss and a stark, brutal kind of survival. The soft, hopeful girl who had ridden west in a wagon, dreaming of a homestead and a white picket fence, was gone. She had been burned away in the raid, scoured out by the dust and the thirst and the fear. The woman looking back at her from the water's surface was someone else entirely, a harder, quieter being who had been forged in the wilderness. Freedom without a place to belong, she thought, the words forming slowly in her mind, is just another kind of desert. Her old world was a ruin. James was gone. Their wagon, their hopes, their future, all turned to ash. To return to that world would be to return as a ghost, a widow with a story that people would listen to with pity and a shudder of morbid curiosity before turning back to their own safe, ordered lives. She had no home there anymore. And what of the world she had just left? A world of violence and hardship, of constant vigilance and simmering resentments. But it was also a world of profound and simple truths. It was a world of community, a circle of people bound together against a hostile world. It was a world where a man could command no fear in a storm and mean it, where he could grant a captive her freedom not as an act of pity, but as an acknowledgement of her spirit. She had run away to save him, but in doing so, she had stranded herself in an empty space between two worlds, belonging to neither. She had made a choice based on logic, on the idea of honor and sacrifice. But her heart, that stubborn, irrational muscle, was a compass pointing west. It was pointing back into the wilderness, back toward the smoky scent of a piñon fire, back toward a pair of dark, steady eyes that had seen her not as a captive, but as a person. The decision was not a thought, but a feeling. It rose in her like the sun, a slow and certain dawning. Her place was there, her new life, this strange and terrifying and vital existence, was there. Loyalty, she was beginning to understand, was not a thing you were born into. It was a thing you chose, and family was not just about blood. It was about the people you chose to stand with. As the morning sun climbed higher, she stood up, her body aching but her mind clear. She turned her back on the river, on the east, on the ghost of the life she had lost. Her heartbeat was a steady drum, a compass pointing her home, and she began to walk west. Her return to the camp 2 days later was met not with welcome, but with a wave of stunned, furious disbelief. She walked out of the shimmering heat of the afternoon, a solitary, determined figure, and the camp fell into a sudden, shocked silence. Nantan was the first to react. A look of pure, venomous triumph crossed his face. He strode forward, his hand on the knife at his belt. "See," he snarled. his voice loud for all to hear. "The White Witch has returned. She works her magic on our leader, and now she comes back to finish the job, to lead the Blue Coats to us." Several of the other young warriors moved to stand with him, their face hard masks of anger and suspicion. They began to close in on her, a threatening circle of hostility. Evelyn stood her ground, her heart pounding, but she did not flinch. She had made her choice. She would face the consequences. Before they could reach her, Kohana stepped into their path. He had come from his shelter, his face impassive, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fire. He did not look at Evelyn. His gaze was fixed on Nantan. He said nothing, but his presence was a solid, unbreachable wall. Nantan faltered, the momentum of his rage broken by his leader's silent authority. He spit on the ground near Evelyn's feet. "She brings death," he hissed. "She chose for herself," Kohana said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. He turned his head and finally looked at Evelyn, his expression unreadable. "She has a right to walk her own path. She has chosen to return." The statement hung in the air, a radical and dangerous idea. He was not claiming her as his captive. He was declaring her a free agent, a person who had made a conscious choice to be there. He was changing the entire dynamic, elevating her from a piece of property to an individual. It was a gamble, a direct challenge to the fear and hatred that Nantan had been cultivating. Before the standoff could escalate, a rider appeared on the ridge above the camp, his horse lathered in sweat. He was one of their scouts, and his urgency was palpable. He slid from his horse and ran to Kohana, his words coming in a torrent of their own language. But Evelyn did not need a translation. She saw the look on Kohana's face, the sudden hardening of his jaw, the grim light in his eyes. The internal conflict of the camp was about to be dwarfed by a far greater threat. Kohana turned to his people, his voice now ringing with the clear, sharp tone of command. "Blue Coats," he called out. "2 days behind us. They found the trail from the burned wagons. They are tracking us." He paused, and his gaze swept the crowd, finally landing on Evelyn. "They are tracking their stolen supplies, and their captive." The words fell like stones into a silent pool. The external world, the relentless pressure of the society that was hunting them, had found them. The camp exploded into a frenzy of controlled, purposeful activity. There was no panic, only a grim and practiced efficiency. Shelters were dismantled in minutes. Belongings were packed onto horses and travois. The long poles that would be dragged behind the animals, the wounded from the initial raid, men who were still recovering, were carefully helped onto horses. The women worked with a silent, furious energy, their hands a blur of motion as they secured bundles and packed supplies. As they worked, they began to sing. It was not a war cry, but a low, rhythmic chant, a song that was both a lullaby and a lament. It was a song of endurance, a song of a people who had been on the move for generations, a song of sorrow and of the unbending will to survive. Evelyn stood for a moment, useless and apart, a stranger in the midst of this whirlwind of communal purpose. Then, the old woman who had told her the story of Kohana's brother came to her. Her face was a mask of grim determination. She did not speak. She simply took a long strip of cloth from her bundle. It was dyed a deep, rich red, the color of the earth itself. She pressed it into Evelyn's hand. Her gnarled fingers squeezed Evelyn's for a brief, powerful moment. It was a gesture of acceptance, a welcome into the circle of their struggle. It was a gift of courage. Evelyn tied the cloth around her arm. She was no longer a ghost between worlds. She had chosen her ground. She went to help a woman lift a heavy bundle onto a travois. Her movements clumsy at first, but her heart filled with a fierce and unfamiliar sense of belonging. She was part of this now. This was her family. This was her fight. As the last of the camp was being packed, a sound drifted on the wind, faint but unmistakable. It was a thin, metallic cry, the sound of a bugle from a distant cavalry column. It was a promise of iron and fire. a declaration that the world of straight lines and fences was coming for them. The hunt was on. The night before they were to flee was a held breath. The camp was packed and silent, a collection of tautly bound bundles and sleeping forms, ready to dissolve into the landscape at the first hint of light. A sliver of moon gave little light, leaving that duty to the stars, which burned with a cold, fierce intensity in the blackness of the high desert sky. The fire had been allowed to burn down to a bed of deep red embers that pulsed with a secret heat, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar shapes of the rocks and junipers seem like watchful spirits. The only sounds were the soft stamp and nicker of the restless horses and the low, constant voice of the wind as it whispered through the canyons. Evelyn sat wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, the coarse fur a comfort against the chill. She was not tired. Her mind was a battlefield of fear and a strange, defiant calm. Tomorrow, the bugle call she had heard would become a reality of gunpowder and steel. Tomorrow, she would either be dead or recaptured, or she would be truly and finally one of these people, running for her life alongside them. She had made her choice, walked back from the river into the heart of the fire, but the finality of it was only now settling into her bones. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows near the rocks. It moved with a familiar, unnerving silence. It was Kohana. He came and stood before the embers for a long moment, his profile a stark and rugged silhouette against their dying glow. He seemed to be listening to the night, to the messages carried on the wind. Then he turned and came to her, settling on the ground beside her. He did not sit too close, but his presence was a tangible thing, a center of gravity in the tense and waiting night. He did not speak for a long time. They sat together in a silence that was not empty, but filled with the unspoken weight of all that had happened and all that was to come. He finally shifted, turning to look at her. "The path ahead is hard," he said. His voice was a low murmur, almost part of the wind. "There will be little rest." "I am not afraid of being tired," she answered, her own voice quiet but steady. He nodded slowly, accepting her words. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. "Our ancestors watch from there," he said. "They see our hearts. They know our choices." His words were not meant to be poetic. They were a statement of fact, a core belief that gave the night and their precarious situation a different, deeper meaning. They were not alone in their struggle. He was quiet for another long moment, and she could sense a struggle within him. He seemed to be searching for something, a word, a way to begin. He reached out and his fingers lightly brushed the beaded bracelet on her wrist, the one he had loosened before. His touch was hesitant, a question. "You came back," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of wonder. She had asked herself that question 1,000 times on the long walk back from the river. The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. "I was more lost there than I am here." A small, almost imperceptible sound escaped him, a quiet exhalation of breath. He looked from her face to the fire, then back again. His gaze was intense, as if he were trying to see past her eyes, into the very thoughts she had just spoken. There was something he needed to say, something that had been sitting behind his stoic silence for days. "There is a word," he began, then stopped, an old word. "From the before times." He struggled, his knowledge of English a clumsy tool for the delicate thing he was trying to build. He touched his own chest, his fingers spread over his heart. He took a breath. "So tight, so new." The words fell into the stillness between them, strange and nonsensical. Evelyn frowned, a flicker of confusion, of old fears, stirring in her. Was this some kind of threat? A crude description? The man had shown her nothing but a strange, formal respect. But in this moment of high tension, her old prejudices were a ghost whispering in her ear. He saw the confusion, the flash of fear in her eyes, and a look of frustration crossed his face. "No," he said, shaking his head, "not this." He gestured vaguely at their bodies. He pressed his hand harder against his own chest, his knuckles white in the dim light. Here, the heart. He leaned forward slightly, his earnestness a palpable force. His voice was barely a whisper, forcing her to lean in to hear him over the wind. It is when the heart, it is squeezed. When a feeling comes for the first time, a feeling that has no name because it has never been before. It is big, too big. It fills up all the empty places. It makes the heart feel full and tight, and everything is new. The world is new. The sky is new. His breath hitched on the last word. His gaze was locked on hers, his own heart, his own vulnerability, laid bare in the simple, broken words. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. A wave of heat washed through her, a fire that started deep in her chest and spread through every inch of her body. It was not the fire of fear or of shame. It was the fire of a profound and staggering revelation. He was not talking about a physical act. He was talking about love. He was describing, with the clumsy, beautiful poetry of a second language, the moment a human soul is irrevocably changed by a new and overwhelming emotion. He was telling her what he felt. He was telling her that she had made his world new. Her own heart felt tight, squeezed by an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. This stoic warrior, this man of silence and violence and deep, quiet honor, was sharing the most fragile part of himself with her. He had given her a name, Tahina, New Dawn. Now he was telling her why. She was his new dawn. A small, shaky laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure, wondrous disbelief. "You speak English. It is new," she said softly, but very tight. A ghost of his rare smile touched his lips. He did not look away. "Tight," he said, his voice a low vibration that she felt more than heard. "So the words do not fall away." He held out his hand. She placed hers in it without hesitation. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they closed around hers, a silent and unbreakable promise. He pulled the heavy buffalo robe he was wearing and draped it over her shoulders as well, creating a small, shared world of warmth against the vast, cold night. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped, their shoulders touching, wrapped in the same robe. They did not speak. There were no more words to say. They simply looked up at the star-dusted sky, at the silent, watching ancestors. This was their vow, a quiet knitting together of two souls under the immense and holy darkness. But they were not entirely alone. From the deep shadows behind a cluster of rocks, Nantan watched. His body was rigid with a cold, pure hatred. He had seen Kohana approach the woman. He had watched them sit together, had seen the intimate gesture of the shared robe, the joining of their hands. He could not hear their words, but he did not need to. The image was enough. It was the ultimate betrayal. While their people were being hunted on the very eve of a battle that could destroy them, their leader was sharing a blanket with the white witch who had brought this curse upon them. In Nantan's eyes, this was not love. It was a sickness, a weakness that would be the death of them all. His jaw tightened, and a decision that had been a seed of resentment now hardened into a stone of certainty. He would not let this man, this fool blinded by a white woman, lead his people to ruin. He slipped away as silently as he had come. A venomous thought coiled in his heart. In the small, warm world under the buffalo robe, Evelyn and Kohana did not notice his departure. They were lost in the profound stillness that had settled between them. The fire had burned down to a soft, barely visible glow. The wind had gentled to a sigh. Then a new sound cut through the night, sharp and mournful. It was the call of a great horned owl, a solitary, echoing hoot that seemed to fall from the stars themselves. It was a sound of the deep wilderness, a cry of the hunter in the darkness. It sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine, a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Kohana heard it too. His hand tightened on hers for a brief, almost imperceptible moment. In the language of his people, the owl was a messenger, a bringer of news from the spirit world. Its call on a night like this was not a thing to be taken lightly. It was an omen, a premonition of the iron storm and the acrid smoke of gunpowder that was coming with the dawn. The owl's cry faded, leaving a silence that was deeper and more unnerving than before. The pre-dawn air was cold and still. They were meant to move before the sun rose, to use the darkness as a shield. But the darkness offered no protection. It was a trap. The first sound was the bugle. It was not the distant, almost mournful call from the day before, but a sharp, brazen slash of sound that tore the quiet night apart. It came from the ridge above them, the very direction of their planned escape. It was a cry of discovery, a signal to attack. Before the last note of the bugle had faded, the night exploded in a series of sharp, deafening cracks. Puffs of dust and rock chips erupted from the canyon walls around them. The flat, heavy report of the Springfield rifles was a sound of absolute authority, a brutal and methodical hammering. There was no war cry from the soldiers, only the disciplined, terrifying rhythm of their volley fire. The camp, poised for a silent departure, was thrown into instant, violent chaos. Horses screamed and reared, their eyes wide with terror, pulling at their tethers. A cooking pot, carefully packed, was sent flying by a stray bullet. The people, who had been sleeping forms moments before, scrambled for cover, their movements swift and desperate. Kohana was on his feet in an instant, his voice cutting through the din, not with a shout, but with a sharp, clear series of commands in his own language. He directed his warriors to the natural cover of the rocks, organizing a defense against an enemy they could not clearly see. Evelyn's first instinct was a pure, animal terror that threatened to root her to the spot. The air was alive with unseen death, the whistle and thud of lead a constant, terrifying percussion. Then she saw the women. They were not screaming or running in panic. They were moving with a desperate, focused purpose, gathering the crying children, pulling them into the most sheltered parts of the rock overhang, their bodies forming a living shield around the young. The old woman who had given Evelyn the red cloth caught her eye and gestured fiercely toward a group of terrified toddlers. The gesture broke the spell of fear. Evelyn scrambled over to the children, her body low to the ground. She helped a woman pull a small, sobbing boy to safety. The warmth of his small, trembling body, a stark contrast to the cold fear in her own heart. She was part of this now. This was her family. This was her fight. The attack was too precise. The soldiers were not firing randomly into the canyon. They were positioned perfectly to block the escape route. Their fire concentrated on the most vulnerable points of the camp. Kohana and his warriors returned fire, their older rifles and bows no match for the range and power of the Springfields, but their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to inflict casualties, to make the soldiers pay for every foot of ground. Amidst the chaos, Evelyn saw Nantan. He was fighting, but there was something wrong. He was not with the main group of warriors defending the pass. He was off to the side, taking pot shots, his movements seeming more designed to keep himself out of the line of fire than to effectively engage the enemy. At one point, she saw him gesture, a quick, almost imperceptible movement that could have been a signal. A moment later, a volley of rifle fire swept the exact spot where Kohana was directing his men, forcing them to scatter. The betrayal was a cold, sick realization in the pit of her stomach. Nantan had not just stirred dissent. He had sold them. He had led the cavalry here. This was not a battle. It was an execution, planned and orchestrated from within. Kohana was everywhere, a whirlwind of motion and command. He seemed to bear a charmed life, moving through the hail of bullets as if he were invisible. He was the heart of the resistance, his courage a fire that kept the others from breaking. He was fighting for his people, for their very existence, and he was being betrayed by one of his own. The battle raged as the sun began to cast a sickly gray light over the canyon. A makeshift shelter caught fire, the flames adding a new, terrifying dimension to the chaos. The horses, now completely panicked, broke free of their tethers and bolted, a stampede of terror that added to the danger. Kohana saw a small group of his men pinned down by a sharpshooter on the ridge. Without hesitation, he broke cover, firing his rifle to draw the shooter's attention, giving his men the chance to pull back to safer ground. It was a brave, selfless act. It was also the opening Nantan had been waiting for. Instead of providing covering fire for his leader, Nantan seemed to stumble, dropping behind a rock, leaving Kohana tragically exposed for a fatal second. The sharpshooter's rifle cracked. Kohana cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain and surprise. He staggered, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his leather shirt. He tried to stay on his feet, to raise his rifle again, but his strength failed him. He sank to one knee, his face a mask of agony. Evelyn saw him fall. The world narrowed to that single kneeling figure. The sound of the battle, the screams of the horses, the cries of the children. All of it faded into a dull roar. All that existed was Kohana, wounded, vulnerable, and alone. A single thought, a raw and primal scream, erupted from her soul. I will not leave you again. She did not know if she said the words aloud. She was already moving. She broke from the cover of the rocks, running across the open ground that was being chewed up by rifle fire. Bullets kicked up dust at her feet, one whining past her ear so close she felt its heat. She did not slow. Fear was a distant thing, a ghost that could not touch the fierce, burning certainty in her heart. She reached him, falling to her knees beside him in the red dust. His face was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "Tahan," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Run. Go to them. Save yourself." She shook her head. Tears she did not know she was crying, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "My life is here," she said, her voice fierce with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. She ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, her hands shaking, and pressed it hard against the wound in his side. The blood was hot and slick against her fingers. A new voice, harsh and amplified by the canyon's acoustics, bellowed from the ridge above. "Return the white prisoner. The woman is to be released immediately." Evelyn looked up, shielding her eyes against the rising sun. She could see them now, a line of blue-coated soldiers on the ridge, their rifles aimed down at the chaos. A man on a large bay horse, an officer with gold on his collar, was staring down at her. Captain Reeves. He saw a white woman in a tattered dress, kneeling beside a wounded Apache warrior, her hands covered in his blood. He saw a scene that confirmed every story he had ever heard, every prejudice he held. "I said release the prisoner," he yelled again, his voice tight with righteous anger. Evelyn looked from the captain's cold, uncomprehending face to Kohana's, which was etched with pain but also with a fierce, protective love. Her choice had been made long ago, on the long walk back from the river, but now she would declare it to the world. She rose to her feet, a small, defiant figure in the heart of the battlefield. "I am not a prisoner," she shouted, her voice ringing out with a strength she did not know she possessed, a strength born of love and loyalty. "I choose this. I am where I belong." A stunned silence fell over the ridge. Captain Reeves stared, his mouth agape. His simple, black-and-white world of soldiers and savages, of captives and rescuers, had just been shattered by the clear, unwavering voice of a 19-year-old woman. Before he could respond, a new sound joined the fray. It was a war cry, but it came not from the canyon floor, but from the ridges behind the soldiers, a new band of warriors, appearing as if from the earth itself, swept down from the high ground. Led by a grim, older warrior with the authority of a seasoned war chief, Kohana's scouts had reached them. The hunters had become the hunted. The cavalry's tactical advantage was gone, caught in a crossfire. With their flank exposed, their position was suddenly untenable. "Captain Reeves," his face a mask of fury and frustration, gave the order to withdraw. The bugle sounded again, not the call of attack, but the sharp, reluctant notes of retreat. As the soldiers pulled back, the older warrior and his men swarmed into the canyon. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the wounded, the dead, the burning shelter. He saw Kohana on the ground, and the white woman with her hands stained red, refusing to leave his side. Then his eyes fell on Nantan, who was emerging from his cover, a look of thwarted rage on his face. The old chief walked directly to him. He spoke, his voice low and cold, but every warrior in the canyon heard his words. He pointed to the ridge where the soldiers had been so perfectly positioned. He held up a small, blue piece of wool, the kind used for military uniforms, that he had found snagged on a bush on the trail Nantan had supposedly been scouting. The evidence was undeniable. The betrayal was laid bare for all to see. "The judgment was swift. You have no people," the old chief said, his voice like the chipping of flint. "You have no ancestors. You walk alone." He turned his back on Nantan, a gesture of ultimate contempt. Nantan stared, his face a canvas of disbelief and hatred. Then, with a final, venomous look at Kohana and Evelyn, he turned and scrambled up the rocks. A man without a tribe, a ghost condemned to wander the wilderness alone. The battle was over. The canyon was filled with the sounds of the wounded, the smell of smoke, and a ringing silence where the rifle fire had been. Evelyn knelt beside Kohana again, her hands still pressed to his side, the warm blood a stark and terrible symbol. It was the price of her choice, the cost of her freedom. It was a silent, unbreakable oath, sealed in the red dust of the American West. They did not stay in the canyon of blood and betrayal. Under the direction of the old war chief, whose name was Dasoda, they gathered their wounded and their dead, salvaged what they could from the wreckage, and moved on. They traveled for the rest of that day and deep into the night. A silent, limping procession of ghosts. Kohana, drifting in and out of consciousness, was carried on a travois, the poles bumping and scraping over the rocky ground. Evelyn walked beside him, her hand never far from his, her face a grim mask of determination. They finally made their sanctuary in a place the wind could not find. It was a high, narrow valley, a secret crease in the vast landscape, walled by sheer cliffs and carpeted with a thick growth of ancient cedar trees. A clear, cold stream, born from a spring high in the rocks, ran through its center, the water making a sound like scattered silver coins. The air was clean and sharp with the scent of cedar and damp earth. It was a place of healing, a place to hide and mend. Here, the desperate forward flight ended, and the slow, arduous work of recovery began. The people set up a temporary camp, their movements weary but methodical. The few remaining shelters were erected. Traps were set in the stream for fish. The children, silent and wide-eyed after the trauma of the battle, were gathered and cared for by the older women. Evelyn's world shrank to the size of the buffalo robe where Kohana lay. The bullet had gone clean through his side, a ragged, angry wound that bled sluggishly and threatened to fester. The old woman who had given Evelyn the red cloth, whose name was Tissin, became her teacher. She showed Evelyn how to boil water with hot stones in a tightly woven basket. She taught her how to chew the inner bark of a willow tree to make a paste that would soothe the pain and fight the fever. She showed her how to gather the sticky, amber-colored resin from the pine trees, warming it to create a potent salve that would seal the wound and keep it clean. The days became a quiet rhythm of care. Evelyn would gently clean the wound, her touch steady despite the tremor in her heart. She would apply the salves and change the dressings of soft, scraped deerskin. She would sit for hours, spooning broth or cool water between his cracked lips. She learned to read the state of his health in the faintest flush on his cheekbones, in the rhythm of his breathing, in the heat of his skin beneath her hand. She was no doctor, but she had a fierce and unwavering will to see him live. In those long hours, The rest of the world fell away. The community, seeing her devotion, her tireless care, granted her a space of quiet respect. The hostility was gone, washed away by the blood they had all shared. Nantan's betrayal had been a poison, but his expulsion was the beginning of the cure. The people had seen where that path of hatred led, and they had seen Evelyn, the white woman, run through a field of fire to kneel at their leader's side. They had heard her defy the soldiers. She had chosen them, and in the quiet logic of their world, that choice held a power greater than the color of her skin. She slowly became a part of the valley's life. When she was not with Kohana, she worked. She carried water from the stream, her muscles growing hard and lean. She helped the women gather roots and berries. She sat with the children, her clumsy attempts to learn their language a source of gentle amusement for them. She was darning a child's moccasin one afternoon when she realized with a jolt that she was humming. She had not hummed, had not felt the slightest stirrings of simple contentment since before the wagon train. The life she was living was harder than anything she could have ever imagined. But it was real. It was a life of purpose. She was no longer a ghost between worlds. She had found her place. One evening, as the first stars began to appear in the sliver of sky above the valley, the slow, solemn beat of a drum began to echo from the cliffs. It was time to honor the dead. The people gathered in a circle in the main clearing. A fire of cedar wood was lit, its smoke rising straight and sweet in the still air. Evelyn helped Kohana, who was now able to stand, leaning heavily on her for support. She led him to the edge of the circle. Dasoda, the old chief, stood before the fire. He began to speak the names of the warriors who had fallen, his voice a low, mournful chant. With each name, a handful of sacred sage was thrown into the fire, the leaves hissing and releasing a pungent, cleansing smoke. It was a ritual of profound sorrow, but also of profound strength. It was a promise that the fallen would not be forgotten, that their stories would become part of the living memory of the people. As the last name was spoken, a deep silence fell over the circle. Every head was bowed in memory. Then, in the quiet, Kohana shifted his weight. He was looking across the circle, not at the fire, not at the chief, but directly at Evelyn. His gaze was clear and steady, and in the flickering firelight, she saw a universe of emotion. It was gratitude. It was wonder. It was a deep and abiding love that needed no words. He stumbled for a half step, a moment of weakness, and in that moment, in front of all his people, his heart spoke more loudly than any words ever could. He was not just their leader. He was a man who had been pulled back from the edge of death by the woman at his side. The circle saw. The circle understood. Later that night, as they sat together near the stream, the sound of the water a soft song in the darkness, he returned to the conversation that the battle had interrupted. "The old words," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "The ones I told you, so tight, so new. They are a prayer." Evelyn waited, listening not just to his words, but to the spaces between them. "Our world changes," he continued, looking up at the stars. "Things are lost. People, land, ways of living. The memories can grow thin, like an old blanket. This prayer, it is to hold on, to remember a feeling so strong that it makes the world new again. It is a way to fight being forgotten, to hold on to what is pure." She finally understood the depth of what he had given her that night before the battle. It was not a simple declaration of love. It was a sacred trust. He was sharing with her the most powerful tool his people had for survival, the preservation of a pure and world-changing memory. He was telling her that she was a feeling, a moment, worth preserving against the end of his world. It was not about possessing her. It was an offering of the highest honor. Tissin, the old woman, walked by, carrying a bundle of herbs. She paused and looked at Kohana, a fond, exasperated look on her wrinkled face. She said something in her own language, shaking her head. "What did she say?" Evelyn asked. Kohana's mouth curved in a faint, tired smile. She said this boy has been stubborn since he learned to walk. He will not rest when he is told. Evelyn laughed, a soft, genuine sound. It seems to be catching, she said. I think I have caught it from him. Tisin heard the laughter and saw the look on their faces. She grunted in satisfaction and went on her way. The next day, as Kohana took his first unaided steps, leaning on a cedar branch for support, Dasoda came to them. He carried a simple string of blue and white beads and a single, perfect eagle feather. He held them out to Evelyn. "You are Tahan," he said, his voice raspy with age. "You are the one who walks between two worlds. You have the heart of our people." He tied the beaded string around her wrist and carefully, reverently, tucked the base of the eagle feather into the knot. It was not a ceremony for a wedding. It was a ceremony of belonging. It was her naming. It was her acceptance. She was no longer Evelyn Whitmore, the lost bride. She was Tahan, the new dawn, a woman of the people. Weeks passed. The deep gash in Kohana's side healed, leaving a puckered, silver scar. His strength returned. He began to walk the valley with his long, familiar stride. The tension and fear in the camp slowly dissipated, replaced by the steady, hopeful rhythm of life. The first touches of spring began to appear in the high valley. The snow on the highest peaks began to melt, and the stream ran fuller, its voice louder, singing a bright, silver song of renewal. The ice was breaking. A new season was beginning. The sanctuary of the hidden valley could not last. Word of a cavalry defeat, however small, traveled on the wind like a sickness, and the story of the white woman who had chosen to stay with her Apache captors became a piece of frontier legend, a tale told with a mix of outrage and morbid fascination in the dusty settlements and army forts that were springing up like bitter weeds across the land. The world found them not with a bugle, but with a messenger. He was a lone rider from a neutral band, carrying a message stick. Captain Reeves of the United States Army demanded a parley. He cited territorial law, claiming the right to reclaim a citizen held against her will. Simultaneously, a delegation from the new settlement of Prospect Creek, the closest white encroachment, demanded the return of stolen property and reparations in the form of horses for the families of those killed in the wagon train raid. The fragile peace of the valley was over. The outside world, with its laws and its ledgers, was demanding an account. The meeting was set for 3 days hence, on a wide, flat-topped mesa that stood as a neutral ground between the mountains and the plains. It was a place of stark and brutal beauty, a windswept stage under an immense sky. On the morning of the parley, Evelyn, now known to all as Tahan, dressed with ceremonial care. Tisin helped her braid her hair, weaving in a single white feather. She wore a simple deerskin dress, the beads at her wrist the only ornament. As she prepared, Kohana came to her. He did not speak of the meeting, of the danger, or of the choice she had to make. He looked at the scar on his side, now a pale silver line against his skin. "This mark," he said, his voice quiet. "It is not from a soldier's bullet. It is the price of a choice. Your choice to come back, my choice to let you, today. They will ask you to pay again. Remember that the choice is still yours. No one can take that from you." They rode to the mesa under a sky the color of faded denim. Kohana and Dasoda led their small delegation of elders. Tahani rode beside Kohana, her back straight, her face calm. She could see the other parties already waiting. Captain Reeves was there with a small honor guard of 10 troopers, their blue uniforms and polished brass a stark, unnatural slash of color against the red earth. Beside them was a group of grim-faced civilians, farmers and merchants from Prospect Creek, led by a stern, black-suited man named Miller. A neutral space had been left between the groups. In the middle sat a lone army clerk at a rickety field desk, his pen scratching nervously in a ledger. They dismounted, and the council began. There were no handshakes, no pleasantries, Captain Reeves spoke first, his voice crisp and official. I am here under the authority of the United States government to secure the release of Evelyn Whitmore, a citizen of this nation, taken by force. The law is clear. You will surrender her to my custody immediately. Miller, the settler leader, spoke next, his voice filled with a self-righteous anger. These savages attacked our people, peaceful families looking for a home. They stole our livestock and our property. We demand justice. We demand the return of what is ours, and we demand their horses as payment for the lives they took. Dasoda listened to it all, his ancient face as still and patient as the rock they stood upon. When the white men had finished, he spoke, his voice a low, raspy sound like wind over stone. His words were in his own language, with Kohana translating. You speak of your law, he said, his eyes on Reeves, but you stand on our land. You speak of justice, he said, looking at Miller, but you plant your crops in the soil that holds the bones of our ancestors. Your justice is a hungry thing. It eats the past and the future. This is pointless, Reeves snapped, impatient with the old man's words. We are not here to debate philosophy. The matter is simple. Release the woman. The matter, Kohana said, his voice cutting in, sharp and cold, is not simple. He stepped forward. He spoke of his brother, taken by soldiers, his hair cut, his spirit broken in the name of their law. He spoke of the treaties signed and then ignored, of the buffalo herd slaughtered to make way for cattle. And he spoke of the raid. It was not a raid for plunder, he said, but an act of desperation, a strike against the iron snake of the railroad that was strangling the life from his world. We did not seek to kill women and children, he said, his voice tight with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. We sought to stop the invasion of our homes. A self-serving justification for murder, Miller sneered. Then Kohana looked directly at Reeves. And what of your justice when it is twisted by lies from within? He held up the small, blue scrap of wool that had been found on the trail. He told the story of Nantan's betrayal, holding nothing back. He spoke of how the soldiers had been led to the canyon, how the escape route had been cut off not by military strategy, but by a traitor's map. He laid his people's own shame bare for their enemies to see. We do not hide our dishonor, he said, his voice ringing with a fierce pride. Our ancestors are our witnesses. We have cast out the man who broke faith with us. Can you say the same of the lies you have been told? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Captain Reeves's face. He had wondered about the perfection of the ambush, the uncanny knowledge of the terrain his scout, a man who had met with a lone Apache informant, had possessed. This changes nothing, he said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. The woman is still our responsibility. Then let her speak for herself. Kohana said. He turned and looked at Tahan. All eyes fell upon her. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. She felt the weight of their gaze, the pressure of two worlds colliding, with her as the fulcrum. She stepped forward into the center of the space, her heart a steady drum. My name is Evelyn Whitmore, she began, her voice clear and strong. Carrying on the wind, I came to this land on a wagon with my husband. He was killed in the raid. I was taken captive. She looked directly at Miller, acknowledging his loss, his pain. Those are the facts, but they are not the whole truth. She then looked at Captain Reeves. I am not a prisoner, she said. I am here by my own free will. I was set free. I was shown the way back to your world, and I chose to return. I chose to come back to these people, because in this hard and dangerous land, they have shown me more honor and more humanity than I ever knew existed. They have given me a name. They have given me a family. This is my home now. This is my choice. The clerk, who had been scribbling furiously, looked up in confusion. What was that name again, he mumbled. Tehan. Tahane, Kohana corrected him from the side, his voice sharp. T-A-H-A-N-E. Write it correctly, so you can tell your children the story right one day. The clerk flushed and bent back over his ledger. The small, dusty moment of humor broke the tension, but also underlined the seriousness of the record being made. Reeves was a soldier, a man of orders and regulations. The situation was now impossibly complicated. The woman was lucid, coherent, and openly defying his attempt to rescue her. His mission was a sham. He was on the verge of creating an incident over a woman who refused to be saved. Just then, one of his troopers rode up and handed him a dispatch. He read it, his face tightening. He folded the paper with a sharp crease. He had new orders. A band of Cheyenne had been raiding the railroad construction crews 100 miles to the north. All available units were to be redeployed immediately to protect the interests of the Union Pacific. The fate of one woman on a dusty mesa suddenly seemed very insignificant. "This is not over," he said. His pride stung. But he had his excuse. He had a way out. He turned to Miller. "My orders have changed. My priority is the railroad. You are on your own." He gave the order, and the cavalry column mounted and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved tension behind them. Miller and the settlers were now alone, facing the grim Apache warriors without the backing of the army. Their demands for horses and justice suddenly seemed hollow and dangerous. "You have our answer," Kohana said, his voice flat and final. He and his people turned, mounted their horses, and began to ride back toward the mountains, leaving the settlers standing alone and impotent on the windswept mesa. They had lost the battle of words, but they had not won the war. They had, however, preserved their dignity, and they had kept their path to the hidden valley open. That night, as a rare, soft rain began to fall on the thirsty land, a cleansing and a blessing, Kohana and Tahani stood before a small, private fire. There was no crowd, no ceremony of chanting and drums. It was just the two of them, the fire, and the gentle sound of the rain. He took the heavy buffalo robe he wore and draped it over both their shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. He took her hand and placed it on his chest, then placed his own hand over hers, on her heart. "My heart is your home," he said. "And mine is yours," she answered. They did not kiss, they did not need to. They simply stood in the shelter of the shared robe, two hearts beating as one, and looked into each other's eyes for a long, long time, their quiet promise witnessed by the fire and the healing rain. In the distance, the faint, straight line of telegraph poles ran parallel to the unseen, ancient trail of the deer. Two worlds, separate but coexisting, under the same dark, patient sky. The rain that had blessed the parley on the mesa was the last breath of a dying season. It washed the dust from the air and the blood from the stones, and, in its wake, the world felt clean and new. When spring arrived in the high country, it came not as a gentle thaw, but as a vibrant explosion of life. The narrow valley, their place of healing, became a riot of green. The stream, swollen with meltwater, sang a louder song. The people, a smaller, leaner band now, but one forged into a single, resilient heart, felt the ancient pull of the seasons. It was time to move. Their migration north was not a flight, but a journey. They followed the great herds of deer and pronghorn, their path dictated by the rhythms of the land, not by the fear of pursuit. They traveled along the spine of the mountains, dipping down into lush, sun-drenched meadows and following the course of a great, green river that carved a life-giving path through the wilderness. Tahani rode not as a passenger, but as a full member of the tribe. The woman who had once been Evelyn Whitmore, a bride dreaming of a static, fenced-in life, had become a creature of the open spaces. Her body was lean and strong. Her hands, once soft, were now capable and sure on the reins of her horse. She had learned to read the sky for signs of rain, to distinguish the track of a deer from that of a wolf, to find the hidden pockets of water in a dry landscape. She had learned to be quiet, to listen to the world around her with an intensity she had never known. But her greatest transformation was internal. She no longer felt like a soul torn between two worlds. She had become the bridge between them. She carried the memory of James and their simple, lost dream not as a wound, but as a part of the woman she had become. She had loved him, and that love had been real. But the girl who had loved him was gone. Tahani looked at the world with new eyes. She saw beauty not in what could be owned and tamed, but in what was wild and free. Love, she had learned, was not a fence built around two people. It was a shelter, a place of rest you carried inside you, a home that could never be burned down or taken away. And freedom was not an absence of walls, but the courage to define your own boundaries, to stand on the frontier of your own heart and not be afraid. She saw the change in Kohana as well. He was still their leader, his authority unquestioned, his strategic mind as sharp as ever. But the hard, solitary shell he had worn had been cracked open. The weight of command, which he had once borne alone, was now a shared responsibility. He listened more. He sought the counsel of DeSoto and the other elders not just as a formality, but with a genuine humility. He had learned that true strength was not the ability to stand alone, but the wisdom to stand together. His power was no longer just the sharp edge of a warrior. It was tempered with a deep and quiet compassion. Tahani would see him stop to help a child who had fallen. His large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he brushed the dust from a small knee. She saw him sit with the oldest members of the band, listening patiently to their stories, honoring the memories they carried. He led now not just by command, but by connection. He had been a man fighting for the survival of his people. He had become a man nurturing the soul of his family. Their own love was a quiet, constant presence, a warm current that flowed beneath the surface of their new life. It was not a thing of grand pronouncements or passionate displays. It was in the way he would seek her out at the end of a long day's ride, the way his eyes would find hers across the campfire. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of hot willow bark tea for the ache in his old wound. A simple gesture of care that spoke volumes. It was a partnership forged in fire and blood, and now tempered in the gentle rhythms of their shared journey. One afternoon, they had to cross a tributary of the great river, its waters shockingly cold with the memory of the high mountain snows. The current was strong, and the horses fought against it, their breath pluming in the crisp air. Tahani gasped as the icy water swirled around her legs. A clean, sharp shock that seemed to go right to the bone. When they reached the other side, shivering and laughing, she looked at Kohana, her teeth chattering. "The water is cold enough to ache in the bones," she said, her voice a mix of complaint and exhilaration. He looked at her, and his rare, true smile lit up his face, warming her more than any fire could. "The cold reminds you that you are alive," he said, "and it reminds you of home, of the warmth you seek. It is a good thing our home is right here." He drew his horse closer to hers and pulled the edge of his buffalo robe over her shoulders, creating their familiar, shared world of warmth in the middle of the vast, sunlit plain. In that simple, domestic moment of gentle humor, their future felt as solid and as real as the mountains on the horizon. They found their new home in a wide, grassy valley where the river bent like a great silver arm, a place of good water and plentiful game. It was a place to rest, a place to heal, a place for the tribe to be reborn. On their first morning in this new land, Tahani and Kohana rose before the others and walked to the crest of a low hill that overlooked the valley. The sky to the east was a soft wash of pearl and rose. The air was still and cool, holding the promise of the coming day. Below them, the camp was just beginning to stir, the first thin tendrils of smoke rising from the morning fires. They stood together in silence, watching the world awaken. This was their life. It would not be easy. The world of the blue coats and the iron rails was still out there, a relentless and ever-advancing tide. Their future was not a guarantee of peace, but a promise of continued struggle. But they would face it together. They had each other, and they had their people, a small, resilient flame of humanity cupped in the vast hands of the wilderness. The sun broke over the horizon, spilling liquid gold and rose across the plains, chasing the last of the shadows from the valley. A gentle breeze stirred, the first breath of the new day. It whispered through the tall grass and touched Tahane's face like a benediction. The small string of blue and white beads on her wrist. The gift from DeSoto vibrated in the wind. A tiny, silent song for the new day. A testament to the woman who had walked between two worlds and found the courage to build a home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.